You know, if there's one thing that the Great Recession taught us is that greed is not good. The fact is our financial institutions can be hotbeds for corporate fraud and wrongdoing, and they threaten to cripple our nation's economy. And that's exactly what happened in the recession of 2008. Now, the silver lining of that is that catastrophe prompted Congress to pass some of the most revolutionary changes in financial regulations since the Great Depression. Included in those laws are some of the most robust whistleblower protections that our nation has literally ever seen. And what Congress has recognized is that private citizens can function as the canaries in the coal mine. I mean, they have a front row seat when this sort of stuff is transpiring. And we want to incentivize and protect people for coming forward and blowing the whistle about this sort of corporate fraud or conduct. There are two workhorses that protect financial whistleblowers. There's the Sarbanes-Oxley Act and the Dodd-Frank Act. And what those statutes do in concert is to protect people who come forward with specific information about security law violations or corporate fraud more generally. They come forward with that information and make a complaint to an external agency like the SEC, or according to most courts and the relevant regulations, internal complaints to superiors or internal departments like the Human Resources Department or compliance departments. The whistleblower doesn't actually have to prove that there was a violation of a securities law. He only has to have a good faith, reasonable belief that that has happened. So for example, people that blow the whistle about inaccurate or misleading statements in a company's financial statements or SEC filings, and that's an example of a complaint that would be protected by both the Dodd-Frank Act and the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. Similarly, any sort of reports of insider trading would likewise be protected under the Dodd-Frank Act. And the law provides some pretty robust protections for people that do blow the whistle about these sorts of things. In fact, they can file a charge with the United States Department of Labor or file a lawsuit directly in federal court when retaliation does occur. And if they prevail in a retaliation lawsuit, can recover lost wages and benefits, and actually double damages on their lost wages and benefits, in addition to an order of reinstatement and being reimbursed for their attorney's fees and costs by the company. Now, a second component to the revolutionary changes that Congress made with the Dodd-Frank Act was the creation of the SEC's Office of the Whistleblower. And what that program does is incentivize people that work at these publicly traded companies or banks to provide tips to the SEC regarding any sort of SEC legal violation or corporate fraud. And if that tip constitutes original information that the SEC didn't already have, or for example, wasn't already published and reported on by the New York Times, but if it's original information and it results in the SEC recovering in excess of $1 million, well then the tipster can recover between 10 and 30% of the SEC's recovery. And the SEC's recoveries every year are getting larger and larger and larger, so there's a huge incentive at this point for tipsters to come forward and to submit tips to the SEC. One thing that's pretty neat about the SEC tip program is that a person can give a tip anonymously through an attorney. So in other words, the attorney can be the intermediary with the SEC not needing to know who the tipster was. There has been a huge spike in the number of tips that the SEC has received. Last fiscal year in 2014, they received 3,600 tips. That is an over 20% increase compared to what they did in the previous 2 years. The SEC gave its largest award in fiscal year 2014, a $30 million award to a tipster. Frankly, what that shows is the law is working as it has been intended. We're seeing some very good results when it comes to whistleblowers bringing retaliation lawsuits. And again, the SEC on the Office of the Whistleblower program is seeing increasing recoveries to tipsters. At Van Kampen Law, we feel like it's our patriotic duty to stand behind whistleblowers who are courageous enough to come forward. They're doing a service, frankly, for our country to prevent this sort of catastrophe from happening in the future, and they deserve the very best legal representation.